I've been a pastor now for almost 20 years, and I've served several congregations over the course of those 2 decades. And it's funny, as the years go by, I almost lose track of who belongs to which congregation. I sometimes expect members of previous congregations to be sitting right there, like I can still picture where they sit in the assembly. It's funny how that great cloud of witnesses functions for someone who's been preaching for a couple of decades. And I have met some folks over the course of my ministry that just strike me as incredible class acts when it comes to the practice of Jesus' way. And I want to tell you about a conversation I had with one class act in particular. Was during the pandemic, was at that season of the church's life when we couldn't really see one another face to face. And so a lot of our ministry was happening over text and over Zoom and over the telephone. And my pastoral care team and I had divided up the list of the congregation's members and friends, and we were busy spending our days making calls to the people on that list. And this particular woman was on my list. So I decided to give her a ring just to catch up and hear how things are going, hear how she was surviving the pandemic. She is, in that community, a well-known extrovert, and we know that the pandemic was particularly hard on our extroverted brothers and sisters, neighbors and friends. And so just wanted to catch up and make sure she was doing okay. We had a wonderful conversation. It was so good to hear her voice after so many weeks, maybe even by that point, months apart. And in the course of our catching up, she described for me some happy events that were unfolding in the lives of her children and her grandchildren. And she shared in particular that her granddaughter had taken up with a new beau. And he seemed to be a wonderful young man, and she and the rest of the family were very excited about this young man coming into the family's life, and it seemed as though this might be something that would lead to something more, something special and exciting for families that are always interested in seeing the next generation come along. And in the course of that conversation and that description of the young guy who was wooing her granddaughter, she shared something of a concern. She said, as I think about this situation, the only thing that makes me nervous is it can be hard to tell sometimes if someone's background matches the background of your loved one and our family. I get worried, Grandma confessed, that maybe this young man doesn't come from, for example, a religious family, a Christian family. And not that you can't find a way to move forward with a partner who is of a different religious tradition or no tradition at all, but she said, from my life experience and what I have seen, it is so much harder to do life and relationships and raising kids when there's that difference in background. And she said, you never know about that young man's family. What is that family like? What do they value? How do they treat one another? What was the way of interacting with women folk in the family that was modeled for this young man? What will he be bringing in terms of those sensibilities into this relationship? So she shared, and she just shared, I just get worried about my granddaughter meeting someone whose background is so different that it will make their relationship and maybe even their marriage and maybe even raising kids so much more difficult. We continued our conversation and went on to other topics and finished our conversation, prayed for one another, wished one another well until we got to see one another again and hung up the phone. And It was wonderful. I went on to the rest of my schedule of phone calls, and everything seemed fine. A few days later, I received a handwritten card. And it was from this wonderful class act with whom I had had this conversation about her granddaughter and that granddaughter's new beau. And in her handwritten note, she said, "Ryan, after our conversation, I suddenly realized that you might have misinterpreted what I was talking about with my emphasis on being careful about marrying people of different backgrounds. I certainly, Pastor, did not mean to insult your own marriage." She said that was the furthest thing from my mind, and I hope you understand it. My comments didn't have anything to do with ethnicity or even language per se. It just had to do with religious practice and with family values. It didn't have to do with some of those other things. And I just wanted to reach out to you. And I think she wrote something in the note about I was bashful to do it face-to-face or over a phone call, but I wanted to get this out to you because it was weighing on my conscience, and I wanted to make sure that we are okay. I think she had something cute in there, like, I still expect you to be the one to do my funeral. Please don't refuse to do my funeral. I want to make sure that I didn't inadvertently insult you and your family. And so I reached back out to her and I said, boy, I mean, that is very sweet of you to check. It's very sweet to get a handwritten card. But I can assure you, I did not interpret it in that way at all. But kudos to you, sister, for having the sensitivity to just make sure. That example of going above and beyond when it comes to the practice of repentance is what Jesus is talking about in this section of the Sermon on the Mount. Most of us are familiar with reactive repentance, the kind of reactive repentance that is described in Matthew 18. When you do something that hurts someone around you, and that person who was hurt, the person who was sinned against, comes to you and says, "Sister or brother, you did me wrong, and I want you to know about it, and I desire for us to be reconciled." And then the person who did the wrong has an opportunity to apologize, to own that mistake. And if that doesn't work, then Jesus describes a process by which more and more members of the church's body come alongside the conversation so that reconciliation can be accomplished. We are, in this church, very familiar with reactive repentance. But Jesus is describing something that I would call proactive repentance, particularly when it comes to anger or frustration. When you are experiencing anger or frustration, and maybe you let the person who is the source of your anger or frustration know about it. And maybe you let them know about it in a way that isn't exactly Christ-like. Or, as is so often the case, maybe you are angry or frustrated in an entirely different situation, with an entirely different person, in an entirely different setting. But for some reason, in your anger and frustration, you let that come out against someone who is completely unrelated to the situation. In today's selection from the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus calls us to be proactive in our repentance, to go to those who have been on the receiving end of our anger and frustration, and to say, I just want to check with you if we're okay, because I realize that I was a little cranky. I realize I may have said the wrong thing. I realize that what I've said might have been misinterpreted. I realize that my frustration with another person or another situation might have leaked out in an unhealthy way toward you. And I want to check if we're okay. That's what that classy Christian in a previous congregation did with me. That is what I have tried to do in my own ministry. That is what Jesus invites us to do as a people of faith. And though I would certainly uphold for you kind of the rule of thumb that comes out of the Alcoholics Anonymous tradition, that when you are trying to be proactive in pursuing reconciliation with those you may have harmed or insulted, you probably should only do that if doing so will not cause further damage. But that possibility is not enough to let us off the hook. We should be the kind of people who practice Christ-like humility and check with one another that our relationships are okay. And when we speak out of anger, when we speak out of frustration, when we say true things, but we say them behind the person's back, when we say true things, but we say them in a way that is uncharitable, or when we say untrue things and realize that we were way off base. In any of those situations, the invitation from the Spirit is to take the initiative to go to that person whom you harmed and say, I'm sorry. And to say it in the Spirit of Jesus.